Welcome to Echoes of War. In this video, we go back in time to 1775, where we see a young, 23-year-old Washington prevail.
Right. Let's jump straight into this explainer and transport ourselves back into the middle of what is easily one of the most brutal, consequential 3 hours in all of American military history. We're heading back to July 9th, 1755. It's a battle that often gets overshadowed, but honestly, it was absolutely foundational. Today, we're unpacking the Monongahela massacre, and specifically, the completely impossible survival of one young colonial officer. 4. Think about that number for a second. That is the exact number of heavy musket balls that violently tore right through the coat of a 23-year-old Virginia militia officer. He was riding through the thick Pennsylvania wilderness, actively sick with dysentery, literally barely strong enough to even sit up in his saddle. Yet 4 separate times, hot lead ripped through his uniform and somehow completely missed his body. 2 is the number of massive horses that were shot dead right out from under this very same officer. He was riding through what terrified witnesses later described as a literal hurricane of invisible fire. And every single time a 1,200-pound horse collapsed beneath him, he just shook it off, calmly remounted another one, and rode directly back into the absolute chaos of the collapsing British formation. And 0. 0 is the frankly miraculous number of wounds he actually sustained during this entire slaughter. Not a single scratch. His name, as you might have guessed, was George Washington, and his survival on this day wouldn't just become some wild frontier legend. The brutal lessons burned into him during these 3 hours would ultimately forge the future of an entire nation and eventually bring down an empire. So moving into part 1, the invisible fire. To really grasp exactly how Washington made it out alive, we first have to drop right into the chaotic crucible of the massacre itself. Picture this scene, because the sheer scale of the mismatch here is wild. It's 1 p.m., you have 1,400 veteran British soldiers. We are talking the absolute finest, most disciplined infantry in the British Empire. Guys who are used to fighting on the wide-open fields of Europe, and they are crammed shoulder to shoulder onto this tiny 12-foot dirt road they had just carved through the dense, old-growth Pennsylvania forest. They're marching in full, bright red military pageantry with fifes and drums playing. And then, without any warning at all, it felt like the trees themselves suddenly opened fire. Within just the first 30 minutes of this engagement, 63 out of the 86 British officers on the field were either dead or bleeding out in the dirt. That is over 70% of their leadership, gone in half an hour. And this wasn't random bad luck. They were being systematically picked off by hidden marksmen who fully understood a core truth. If you dismantle the command structure, a rigid conventional army simply stops functioning. Which brings us to part 2, doctrine versus the forest. We really have to ask ourselves, how on earth did the most powerful professional army on the planet march completely blind into a catastrophe like this? Well, it comes down to a fatal mismatch in tactics. You see, the British commander, Major General Edward Braddock, brought traditional European linear warfare right into the thick Appalachian woods. He fully expected visible enemies lining up on open ground. Instead, he collided with a coalition of French and Native American fighters who perfectly adapted to their environment. They used irregular warfare, so concealment, deadly precise marksmanship, and the sheer psychological terror of invisible, surrounding fire. Braddock's whole doctrine demanded targets you could see. The forest just gave him smoke and shadows. And the most frustrating part, this disaster was entirely preventable. Weeks before the battle, Shingas, a very prominent king of the Delaware, actually met with Braddock to offer a crucial alliance. All he asked was if his people could live and trade on the land once the French were defeated. Braddock's response was chillingly arrogant. He said no savage should inherit the land. His absolute certainty led him to just dismiss the indigenous allies who intimately knew the forest. He literally bought his own defeat with a single sentence, turning away hundreds of expert scouts and marching his army forward totally blind. Meanwhile, the French and their Native American allies had mastered what was called La Petite Guerre, the small war. The indigenous warriors of North America had been fighting and perfecting this style for generations. It was the absolute perfect tactical response to this dense environment. But the British military institution, they simply considered it dishonorable and stubbornly refused to learn it until the trees were literally raining lead down upon them. All right, part 3, the command structure collapses. Let's look at the actual geometry of how the British forces mechanically fell apart under fire. When the British vanguard took that first wave of fire, the Native American warriors didn't just stand directly in front of them and trade shots, not at all. They instantly poured into the timber on the left and right, forming this deadly U-shaped half-moon, a classic horseshoe envelopment. They were firing down from elevated ridgelines that the British hadn't even bothered to scout, trapping this long, dense column of redcoats in a crossfire where they literally had nowhere to run. The battlefield instantly turned into pure chaotic geometry. Even though the French commander was killed in the opening seconds, his second-in-command rallied the troops right away and sent the warriors pushing down the flanks. Up front, the terrified British vanguard retreated backward, smashing right into their own advancing main body. Because they were stuck on a 12-foot road, they couldn't spread out. Deprived of officers to tell them what to do, the regular soldiers just bunched up shoulder to shoulder, firing massive, completely blind volleys up into the canopy, just blowing branches off trees. And tragically, when the colonial provincial soldiers, the guys from Virginia who actually understood how to fight from behind cover, broke formation to hide behind trees, the panicked British regulars shot them in the back, mistaking them for the enemy. If you want to understand the true scale of this defeat, just look at these numbers. You have a smaller, highly adaptable force of just 891 fighters, absolutely dismantling a conventional force of 1,400. In just 3 hours, the British suffered roughly 900 casualties, while the French and Native American coalition lost, at most, 90 men. It wasn't magic, you guys. It was simply the triumph of terrain and rapid adaptation over rigid, unyielding doctrine. Which takes us right into part 4, Washington takes the reins. Because with the battle totally lost, General Braddock mortally wounded, and the entire command structure erased, a 23-year-old Washington had to step into the void. Despite being incredibly sick, Washington just shoved his fear aside. He didn't panic. With all the other military aides either dead or wounded, he rode his horse back and forth across this absolute slaughterhouse, transmitting orders from the dying general. He essentially became the sole remaining communication link for the entire army. He then calmly organized the remnants of the colonial forces into a rear guard to extract the survivors, personally helping to load Braddock's bleeding body into a cart, effectively saving the entire expedition from total 100% annihilation. Just days later, Washington actually wrote this exact quote to his brother. He was genuinely awestruck by his own improbable survival, attributing the whole thing to Providence. But what's super fascinating to me is that in the very next sentence of that same letter, he expressed this clear-eyed, cold fury that they were so easily beaten by a smaller force. Even at 23, he wasn't just relieved to be alive, he was intensely analyzing exactly why the British doctrine broke so quickly. As for General Braddock, he lingered for a few agonizing days during the chaotic retreat. And right before he died, his absolute unshakable certainty finally broke. He reportedly whispered, "We shall know better another time," realizing way too late that his life's work and military doctrine had completely failed. In a really poignant final gesture, he bequeathed his blood-stained silken officer's sash to Washington, the young colonial guy he had consistently ignored but who had ultimately been completely right. Now, this next detail is where Washington's cold, practical leadership really shines through. When Braddock finally died on July 13th, Washington knew that any visible grave would immediately be dug up and desecrated by enemy scouts tracking them. It would be a huge psychological victory for the enemy. So he made a really tough call. He read the burial rites and then buried Braddock right in the dead center of the dirt road. Then he ordered the entire retreating army, wagons, horses, men, the whole shebang, to march directly over the fresh grave, packing down the earth and completely erasing it. The wilderness literally just swallowed the general whole. Finally, we reach part 5. A myth is born. Yes, what happened on the Monongahela was a catastrophic defeat. But as we're going to see, it inadvertently served as a brutal, unforgettable academy for the future. Just weeks after the smoke cleared, a very influential preacher named Samuel Davies gave a public sermon that pointed directly at Washington. This quote right here crystallized an instant frontier legend. This idea that Washington was basically unkillable, that God had specifically preserved him for some higher future purpose. Now, whether you believe that or not, this myth provided immense stabilizing authority around him during the absolute darkest, freezing days of the coming American Revolution. But let's be real, it was way more than just a myth for Washington. This was a tactical education quite literally burned into him by fire. He learned firsthand that the most powerful army in the world could be absolutely broken. Over the next 20 years, he applied these exact lessons. He strictly avoided pitched battles when his troops weren't ready. He protected his officer corps with absolute ferocity. And he learned to use the terrain as a weapon rather than fighting against it. And as a constant personal reminder of the deadly cost of arrogance, he famously wore Braddock's blood-stained sash into the major battles of the Revolution. So that leaves us with this incredibly fascinating final thought to wrap up our explainer today. By marching all that absolute, rigid certainty into an old-growth forest, did the British Empire accidentally build the exact weapon that would eventually destroy it? Because men like George Washington, Daniel Morgan, and Horatio Gates were all on that dirt road in 1755. They survived, they learned, and 20 years later they would use those exact lessons of irregular warfare to defeat the British Empire itself. Thank you so much for joining me for this breakdown of an incredible historical turning point. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.